Okay, so over the last couple of lessons, we've looked at how industrial revolution begins. We've looked at the impact that it's had on the localities in which it occurs. The last thing we have to look at now is how does it begin to spread the industrial revolution? What is the impact that that has across the globe? One of the things that's really important to understand is that industrialization starts in Europe, right? It starts in Britain, goes to France, goes to Germany and Europe, comes to the Americas, it goes to North America, particularly the United States, and then obviously to Canada. But what's important to notice here is that through the 1800s, industrialization, the factory system, really only impacts Europe. That then the impact globally, let's say, in places like China, Japan, India, and then into Africa, particularly parts of southern Africa, um, also happens in the late 1800s. There's a growth of something called imperialism, the growth of the empire. Now, the reason that this happens is there are a few at least, right? Number one, Europe is relatively resource poor, right? Britain has a lot. Britain has coal, it has um, steel and or at least iron ore underneath the ground. It has the resources necessary to produce industrial items. However, you can't grow things like cotton in England. So you need, or Britain, you need colonies to grow that. You can't grow things like rubber trees, which the sap then produces rubber. You can't grow that in Europe at all. It's a tropical product, so you need a different place. You need a colony. You also obviously need uh, as populations continue to grow, as we talked about in one of the earlier lessons, you also obviously need increased um, food production. So you have resources and food. Secondly, there's also growing competition, right? European countries want to beat the other country. They want to become richer. Even though we're in an industrial society, people still have this mercantilist idea. There is a fixed amount of wealth in the world, and because there's a fixed amount of wealth, if I'm not winning, I'm losing. So there's increased competition and there's a growth of nationalism, there's fear of the other. All of these things are leading to greater amounts of desire to go outside of the country and to establish colonies. And those competitions grow between Britain and France, Britain and Germany, France and Germany. And all throughout this period, there's a lot of growth in competition, growth in nationalism, growth in the demand for the colonies. And we're going to look at that over the course of today. Industrialization and imperialism obviously go hand in hand. And the question that we're going to be looking at today, or the item that we're going to be looking at over today, is how does that connect, right? So, what is imperialism to begin with? Imperialism, as I say here, is the takeover of a country or territory by a stronger nation with the intent of dominating the political, economic, and social life of the people of that nation, of that territory, right? So, what does that mean? In this case, right, we're talking about the takeover of one piece of territory, whether that's in Africa or Asia, by a European power in the late 1800s. So, or in the 1800s in general, right? So, when we talk about this, one of the things that's important to see here is that it's a European nation that is coming into these territories with technology. It's not, again, it's not that Europe never wanted to have a colony in Africa or Asia, it's that they could not have one, right? Europe never had the ability to go into places like Africa and sort of penetrate the whole continent, or China and penetrate the whole continent. But what had changed in the 1800s is that Europe had technology. They had steamships. They had the Gatling gun. They had all of these new technologies that make them superior military forces to places like, the Qing dynasty in China, or the Tokugawa family in Japan, or the Mughal Empire in India. It gives the Europeans a superior fighting ability that they never had in the years ahead. We also typically call this, and it's up on here in the slides, right? New imperialism. Well, what does that mean? What is quote unquote new about it? Well, the imperialism before in the 1500s certainly was imperialism, but it was slightly different. It was not the same style of technological advantage over others, right? The imperialism of the 1500s was not the same thing. So how does industrialization lead to imperialism? I've already talked about the military, the technological benefits, but you also have the demand for raw materials, as I've said, right? As the British, as the French, as the Germans continue to grow, they need more resources. They need raw materials such as cotton. They need more coal in some cases. They need more iron ore. They need things from other parts of the globe. And they also want places to sell their products. They want, as they have more surplus, right, as they grow, as they produce more items, they need a place to sell those items. And the colonies provide that. And as I said a few moments ago, the ability for this is also part of this, right? The Europeans now have the steamship. They now have the technology to go into these places and defeat those, right? So they have the Maxim gun or the Gatling gun. They have the steamships. They have things that give them the ability. They also have new types of medicine. So they have quinine, which is a mineral that is helpful in mitigating the effects of malaria. So all of these things are helping to reduce the resistance, let's say, in European expansion. There are other factors that are going into this, right? We talked a lot about nationalism, and you're going to read a document about nationalism for your homework this evening. So there's a huge growth in national pride in the 1800s, right? One of the things we've talked about is that the 1800s is a period where countries start to coalesce together and countries start to become quote unquote more nationalistic, right? It becomes a demand for the Europeans to express their own superiority. The British are better than the French. And how do we know that? Because we are not French. And there's this growing nationalism. This also is an impact, or an outgrowth, I should say, of Napoleon, right? Napoleon, conquers so much of Europe in the early 1800s, and when he does so, one of the things that happens as a result is that there is a growing nationalism within Europe, right? The Germans don't want to be conquered by a Frenchman anymore, or the Spanish, or the Austrians, or whoever. They don't want to be conquered by this. So how do we know that? How do we define ourselves? We define ourselves as not French, and we're not German. We are whatever we are. There's also growing economic competition, right? Although we are in the industrial age and we have industrial capitalism, people still have these mercantilistic ideas, right? We have these ideas that there is a certain amount of wealth in the world. And if you don't get that wealth and somebody else does, you are losing. So what happens as a result is that there's this massive growth in economic competition. We must beat, if we are Britain, we must beat the Germans, we must beat the French, we must beat the Austrians, whoever. Again, it's this idea that in order to, even though we have even though we have industrial capitalism, we still believe that true wealth is tied to economic success. Or you think of it as how much money is in your bank account. So one of the things that we're trying to look at here is how do we grow wealth? And finally, the last big thing here is social Darwinism. The Europeans are looking around, right? The Europeans are looking at themselves. Fine, the British are better than the French, and the French are better than the Germans, or whoever. But the Europeans are also looking at people of Africa, and people of Africa don't have the Industrial Revolution. They don't have factories. They don't have those things. People look at China. They say that, oh, well, the Chinese don't have factories. So by comparison, the Europeans see themselves as the greatest group of people in the world. And because of that, what you have is this growth of social Darwinism. I'm sure many of you will remember that Charles Darwin, the father of survival of the fittest, right? He wrote his book on the origins of species in 1848, and people then start assigning those ideas to they start assigning those ideas to nation groups. And what happens as a result of that is people start saying, well, if the Europeans are the fittest, then we must be able to sort of take over these places and sort of show our superiority. It's important for us to understand here that imperialism is not just something that happens across Africa and Asia. For places like Germany, you also have the growth of imperialism. So it's important to note here that uh, Germany unifies in 1871, right? So Germany had sort of been coalescing as a country throughout the 1800s. You have the Confederation of the Rhine, you have the German Confederation, you have the Zollverein, you have all these different groups bringing the Germans together, and then finally they sort of officially unify in 1871. So by, let's say, 1900, this is what the map of the globe looks like, right? You have, places like Britain controlling huge swaths of territory. Canada, pretty much all of East Africa, except for a little bit of blips here and there. All of the South Asia in India. So you have India, what would become Pakistan here, India, obviously, and then what is today sort of, Myanmar and things like that. You have Australia, right? You have the Japanese controlling parts of, Korea, and will ultimately get parts of China. You get the Dutch controlling parts of Southeast Asia. You have the French in what would become Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. You have the French in West Africa. You have the Spanish. You have the Dutch, the Belgians, Portuguese. Europe has divided up the globe by 1900. So again, why Africa and Asia? I mean, we've already talked about this. It's resources, it's ability, but anyway, it's the demand for goods, right? Asia has salt, ivory, silks, other materials. It has labor, it has places to sell those goods. It has all of these interesting commodities. For Africa, it's gold, it's diamonds, it's copper, it's tin, it's metals, it's hard products, but it's also foodstuffs, it's peanuts, it's oils, it's rubber, it's other things as well. Europeans want these commodities, and it's important for them to attain those. Finally, we'll look at these motivations for imperialism. It's important for us to understand the words that the people used, right? So, one of the people that you'll hear more about when we look at different colonization individually is Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was a British nationalist who was extremely important in the establishment of South Africa. So what happens is he is part of the first group of people to start moving into British South Africa and establishing the colonies there. And you can see here that he talks about sort of the greatness of the Anglo-Saxon race, the British race. And he justifies why the British need to do this, right? A society which should have members of every part of the British Empire working with one object and one idea, should have its members placed at our universities and our schools, and should watch the English youth passing through their hands, right? Again, talking about how great Britain is.
Take
All
the
right,
hard
so
drive
then
out of the laptop. I can see.
You also have the establishment of Frederick Lugard's establishment of an idea for the British. Again, he's British, and this idea of the rise in East Africa. And he points out here that there are some major reasons, right? There's the increased capital investment, there's competition between the French and everybody else, but it's also partly this idea of establishing more religion, right? So that there's new churches being created. There's all of these demands for understanding, as it says here, the truths of Christianity. It's really establishing this idea. So when we look at the establishment of colonies in Africa, it's all nationalism, it's desire for resources, it's all of these different commodities and goods that people want. Good luck, guys.